Hello, welcome back to What Now on the Threshold of Life, Death, and Grief. And I'm here with my friends and colleagues.
David Kennedy
and Red Keating.
And I'm Julie Brown. And today we have a special guest who is with us for the second time, Dr. Mary Frances O'Connor. Welcome, Mary Frances.
It's so lovely to be back with you all.
Well, we had the pleasure of interviewing you back in January of 2024. That episode was released in February of 2024 on your book, The Grieving Brain. If you haven't listened to it, please go back and have a listen. Fascinating book and discussion. And today we're going to talk about your newest release book, The Grieving Body. And if you don't mind, I'm going to read your bio and then we'll jump in. So Mary Frances O'Connor is a professor of psychology at the University of Arizona, where she directs the Grief, Loss, and Social Stress GLASS Lab, investigating the effects of grief on the brain and the body. Her book, The Grieving Brain, was included on Oprah's list of best books to comfort a grieving friend. She holds a PhD in clinical psychology from the University of Arizona and completed a postdoctoral fellowship in psychoneuroimmunology at the UCLA Seminole Institute for Neuroscience and Human Behavior. Having grown up in Montana, she now lives in Tucson, Arizona. Okay, so as a way of getting started, Mary Frances, you begin the book with a metaphor to understand how grief impacts our body. So could we talk about the bike metaphor?
I love this metaphor because I think it physically reminds us a little bit about what grief is doing. So imagine with me, if you will, you're biking down a lovely city street, leafy, tree-lined, lovely day. And you see in the distance, in the not very far distance, that there's an intersection. And so you're going to need to stop. And so you reach for your handbrakes, except they're not there. And you grab at the handlebar and you realize, oh my gosh, there's no brakes. And then you remember that you're on a beach cruiser bike and you have to pedal backwards to slow yourself down and to brake. And so you manage to stop before you get to the intersection. But what's important about this metaphor is, even though you then go on through your day, your body went through that stress of trying to be in the world the way you would usually be in the world and not being able to, being in a situation where you can't function the way that you expect to. And even when you can figure out how to cope with that, your body has still undergone the stress, the cortisol, the adrenaline. Your mind went through the anxiety and then whatever else. And grieving people are confronting everyday situations again and again and again where things aren't quite right. And so perhaps that helps us to understand why our grieving body both reacts differently than we might expect and is going through a physically stressful experience after the death of a loved one.
And I love that metaphor and just diving into this conversation, because those of us who have worked in the area of grief, we know and we see the impact of grief on the body, and especially over time as you work with individuals. But so often, in the larger kind of culture, we just think of grief as, people being sad or crying or feeling low. And yet it is so physical, shows up in so many ways.
Yeah, it really does. And I think often people don't anticipate that it will be a physical experience. And so then they're left wondering, is there something wrong with me? And why is it taking so long? My body is still reacting. And I think just understanding that it's going to take time, that our bodies require time in order to adjust, can be very normalizing or validating for people.
I certainly appreciate it. And I think it's probably one of the few times where I have read about the reality and the possibility of dying of a broken heart, for instance, and that whole idea that we hear as a cliche, and people don't really put any stock in that, but it's true. And in reading your research, there's some fantastic stuff that you highlight. Maybe you could help us with that a little bit.
People think that dying of a broken heart is a metaphor.
Yes.
And it's not actually a metaphor. So those of us who have studied the physiology of grieving, part of the reason that we felt sure that there would be something there in the EKG or in the blood draw is because we see the mortality statistics in large population level studies. So for example, in a study of about 1.5 million Finnish people, they demonstrated that in the first 3 months after a man's wife dies, he is almost twice as likely to die of a heart attack compared to a man who remains married during that same time. Now, in medical statistics, that is an insanely high risk factor, almost twice as high. In women, it's about 1.8 times as high, so slightly less, but still just an insanely high statistic. And I can't think of a more black and white outcome than heart attack mortality to demonstrate that when our loved one dies, we are having a physiological reaction.
It's interesting, as I was preparing for this interview and reading your book, just a little personal story. My grandfather actually died of a heart attack 6 months after my grandmother died.
Yes.
And I was back to thinking and how we actually said then, oh, he
Yes.
died of a broken heart.
Yes.
But you're right. I think it was kind of said in this kind of like romantic, oh, he died of a broken heart, but he literally died of a broken heart.
And I think, what I am amazed by is in doing interviews, almost everyone has a story like this, right? And so we see it in the statistics, but it is different to hear about the stories of your grandfather. And I think, unfortunately, there is this sort of romanticized notion about it. But let me put it this way, if we said, well, during the risky period of pregnancy, a lot of women die. There is nothing romantic about that, right? So the key here is it is not a beautiful thing that a grandchild loses both of their grandparents within 6 months, for example. And it says to me, it is not enough to know that this is a medical statistic. We really need a call to action of what are we going to do about this? If we know when someone dies in the emergency department, in the ICU, in the nursing home, wherever, that the person standing next to them should then become our patient.
Right.
Yeah.
We need to keep them alive through the process of adapting so that they can go on to continue to be a grandparent or continue to paint or whatever it is that they do in their life that is apart from the person who died.
Yeah. And I think that was one of the sort of the key shifts in thinking is that I think we think of grief as an emotional thing, as a brain thing, a thought process, all in the brain, right? And what you've done so nicely is said, since when was the brain not part of the body,
right?
And the body not part of the mind? I mean, and just what you said there's like we should then, as a result, then that becomes a medical sort of pay medical attention to someone who has found themselves in that grieving situation, especially in the first initial stages, because it's the brain and the body aren't separate.
That's right. So grief is not a disease. It is natural to have a physiological reaction. But this is where I think the analogy to pregnancy is a little bit interesting, right? So no one would say that pregnancy was a disease,
right.
But at the same time, no one would say that pregnancy isn't physiological, right?
Right. Yep.
And although it is a totally typical process and we know how it should unfold in a healthy way, it is also a time of increased medical risk, right? For gestational diabetes, for hypertension. And so we have whole systems of care for people who are going through this medically risky but normal period. And we say, hey, let's give some education around what this experience should be like and things to watch out for. And we offer assessments of people's physical health, and we offer intervention where that is useful. I think we could think of bereavement in the same way. Why, at bereavement support groups, do we never take anyone's blood pressure?
I mean, this has huge implications for primary care, doesn't it?
It really does. Yeah. And importantly, the vast majority of us are resilient. So being, having difficulty sleeping, having difficulty with appetite, finding that you are foggy, that you have brain fog, we actually can anticipate that. We can acknowledge the depth of the loss that this person has had and say, it makes sense that your body is trying to figure out how to be in the world without your loved one. At the same time, if you lose more than 10% of your body weight, I need you back in my office so that we can figure out how to address that together. Or if you are having hypertension, we're going to treat that hypertension as we would for any patient. And also, we're going to see if there are some stress management or bereavement support, things that we might do that could also support your cardiovascular health.
Of course, in your book, the other big piece that physiologically comes out is the immune system and the impact of grief on the immune system and all of what that means.
Yeah.
Which is huge.
It really is. And this, I think it came about in part because while we describe it as the broken heart, and that makes us think about heart attacks and strokes, what we actually see in the evidence in these big data studies is that bereaved people are at increased risk for what they call all-cause mortality. So we actually see increased rates of pneumonia and sepsis. We see increased rates of cancer recurrence, for example, and COPD. So as you start thinking about, well, how on earth, what could the mechanism be that the death of someone whom you feel so close with could affect every different organ system? This is when we start thinking about, well, the impact of the immune system has its role in every organ. The impact of our hormone systems affects every organ. And so that's where, research in my own lab and now bigger studies in other labs have shown bereaved people have higher inflammation, for example, on average for a period of time.
You referred to your own MS diagnosis throughout the book, your own autoimmune condition. And it made me think about a conversation I had with a group of dietitians several years ago who, would often be referred clients from a primary care physicians where there was a new sudden onset of an anaphylactic food allergy.
Yeah.
And this group of dietitians said to me, one of the things we go hunting for is what's happened in your life.
Yes.
Big loss, big stress in the last 3 to 5 years kind of thing. And they said, often there's just something sitting right there.
Yeah.
That's also what we're talking about here, isn't it?
It is. So I think of it this way, because you think, well, why is this happening over bereavement? Why isn't this happening with other stresses? And of course, I can tell you that it does happen with other stresses. But the death of a loved one, we know, is the most stressful event that a human being goes through. Losing your mother, losing your spouse, the death of a child. What we forget is that when we bond with someone, right, you can't really talk about grief without talking about love and bonding. And so when we bond with someone, you fall in love with the person who becomes your spouse, or you fall in love with your baby, you really create a we that your brain encodes, not just you, not just me, but your brain encodes a we. And it means that we think of ourselves as being independent entities, but really, I form the external pacemaker for my partner, right? So when he comes home and hugs me, his heart rate goes down a little bit. For example, his blood pressure goes down a little bit. And he can predict, his body can predict that that will happen whenever he sees me, right? So then the question is, so how do I function in the world as a person with part of the we that's been amputated, right? And so maybe it shouldn't surprise us so much that our body really does take time to regulate on its own. And what that means is that it's going to have some period of time where you're having more difficulty fighting off the flu, or you have more periodontal disease, for example, we see. And so your immune system just isn't functioning as well as it once did. And the question isn't, well, is that grief or not? The question is, first of all, how do we support the body through that? But also, you aren't necessarily broken. Many of these systems that we're talking about, endocrine system and immune system, and even cardiovascular system, it is like riding a bike. It is constantly in operation. You are constantly pedaling and pushing the brakes and so forth. And so we have to learn how to regulate in this body that has the we amputated. And those physical changes we're going to see don't necessarily mean you're broken, but we do also want to make sure that we're supporting healthy functioning. And if we do get to a point where we've drifted over the line into something like my own multiple sclerosis, then we make sure that we address that as soon as possible.
I loved those images and the way, and your summary there. Just loved the way that helps visualize this whole piece, the regulation piece, the we piece. I love the amputation idea, and all of those. I think for any of us going through grief, we see that, we feel that, we understand that, and it's so important because it's affirming, so that people recognize I'm not broken. And
That's right.
I'm not, I'm not needing to get fixed in that way.
And people will say, well, should I take this supplement or something like that? And I say, well, mostly we have to figure out what soothes your body. What calms you when you're having a wave of grief, or when you're feeling lonely, or you're feeling angry or blameful or guilty, right? What actually soothes your body? What brings your heart rate down? Because it isn't, if it's something broken, then of course, yes, when I was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis, I needed to go on the medication for that. Right. But if we're dealing largely with, I can't keep food down, or I can't fall asleep, then those are sort of things where we have to figure out, how do we regulate better, not how do we necessarily give you a pill.
Right.
In the world of inflammation, you speak about who wants inflammation, but right. That it might actually have, I don't know if it's what I'd call it a protective factor, but maybe a nudging factor to move us from protest to despair.
Yeah, I love that.
Can you help us understand what that means?
Yeah.
Because you would think, how could inflammation be any good, right?
Right. I think there is a piece that is hard for us to wrap our head around, which is that our physiology is changing concurrently with our behavior and our emotions changing. That it is, you could say, bi-directional. It isn't necessarily that one thing is causing the other, but that we're this soup, right? We're this milieu, and when we affect one thing, it affects everything else. And what I mean by that is there are two responses that we see to the loss of someone close to us. We see this even in animals, these two behavioral responses, and we see it in infants. So John Bowlby talked about these when he was studying attachment in very young infants. And those two responses we call protest and despair. Now, protest, you will recognize this response to loss if you can imagine you're standing in the grocery store and you look down and your toddler isn't next to you where they're supposed to be. And that feeling of, oh no, they're gone, right? That terrible, and you can just feel the energy as I say that. I have to look for them. I need to call out so they can find me, right? And that comes with a lot of adrenaline and cortisol and all the things that enable us to search for them or to make a lot of noise so they can find us. The other response we have to loss is what they titled despair. And despair is, oh no, they're gone. Now, the information contained is exactly the same. But the feeling of that, the feeling of being dragged down, that gravity, is something we also associate with higher levels of inflammation, lower levels of morning cortisol, for example. And these are physiological responses we see with loss as well. But here's what's interesting about this. So we don't think of despair as having a function. But what's interesting, and just to be really clear, this is not a stage model. You don't like go through all of protest and then you go through all of despair and then you're done. It's not like that. These are just two responses we have whenever we become aware that the person isn't present, right? And we know at some level that they've died. And so the function of despair, even if we think about little animals, is if they are gone, the gravity of the truth of that reality falls in on us and we stop searching for them, right? So despair, as terrible as it feels, has the function of stopping the protest.
Right.
And the protest is very costly for the body. It's very difficult to maintain all that cortisol and adrenaline. And so despair actually does allow us to pause, maybe even withdraw, and to really understand the gravity of what has happened, how much of our life has been impacted by the loss of our daughter or our sister. But despair isn't the end of the story either, even though it has a function, because of course, during a moment of despair, you think, I will feel like this now forever. My loved one will always be gone, and thus I will always feel this way. But we know that's not really how it works either, because despair leaves out hope. In the, grim light of despair, we aren't so aware that we will have grief as part of a life where we restore meaning, where we connect with living loved ones, right? And so if we're supporting someone who is feeling despair, it's okay for them to be in that moment. We don't have to try to cheer them up or make them feel differently, because it's important that they do recognize how deeply impactful this loss is. And we can also lend them our hope. We can say, look, I don't know what your life is going to look like. You don't know what your life is going to look like. But we are going to figure this out together. I will be here with you until we find a way to restore a life that has meaning for you.
I love the fact that you highlight it. This is not stages where we get through one the other. I envision it as kind of like that transactional model where we're going back and forth,
Yep.
and people can experience that protest and then they move over to despair. But and then they'll find themselves, because of something going on that will bring them that protest back. So
Yes.
it's not, and people, I think, see that as somehow that they're going backwards when they experience that protest again, when in fact that's not true. It's just, it takes a long time to move between these two, to regulate ourselves to where we're going.
Yes. Grieving is a form of learning, right? And it takes a long time to learn things. I mean, you didn't just wake up one day and know your multiplication tables, right? And then you didn't the next day learn calculus. You have to figure it out as you go along. Every time you ride your bike, you learn a little bit. Oh, this is how I ride the bike going downhill. This is how I ride the bike crossing a street. This is how I ride the bike, right? And grief is a little bit like that. Every day you have to figure out, how do I live on a Monday without my spouse? Now, how do I live on a Tuesday without my spouse?
Can you speak a little bit about when we get caught in the place where we can't tolerate the despair? And so what happens to us, or maybe even what does it look like for people who get stuck in protests? Because that part really had me thinking about some folks that I have seen sometimes get caught almost in some obsessive type of behaviors and the consequences of that for the body.
I like to say that we need a big toolkit of coping strategies because when we have a wave of grief, it's going to be slightly different every time. We're in a different context when the wave of grief hits us, and we need a different strategy for different moments. So I'll give you an example. After my mother died when I was 26, this was in my little tiny rural hometown in Montana. My best friend and I went to get breakfast. She had died around a little after midnight. And we went to this wonderful Mexican restaurant. And, you know, small town, the woman who owned the restaurant came by and said, "Hey, I know your mother was in the hospital. I'm so sorry." And I said, "Yeah, she passed away last night." And she said to me, "Oh, mija," she said, "What can I bring you? You can have anything, you know." And I said, "Can I have a beer?" At 8 a.m. And she said, "Of course you can." And she brought me a beer. Now, that was a perfectly appropriate coping strategy for me to pull out of my toolkit at that moment. I really needed a beer. I really was not coping very well with reality in that moment, and the beer helped. Now, if I had a beer every morning for the rest of my life for breakfast, probably things would go a little off track for me, right? And so this is what I mean about we need different coping strategies at different moments. If I'm walking into a work meeting, that's a very different coping strategy as I feel myself start to get welled up than if it's Saturday afternoon and I'm taking a walk in the park and I can reach out and text my sister and say, "Oh my gosh, I'm thinking about mom, and you know, she loved when the crocuses came up and I'm seeing crocuses." And then she writes back to me and says, "Oh, I remember blah, blah, blah." And I say, "I miss her." And she says, "Yes, but she also drove me nuts." Right. And then we have a different coping strategy for that moment. So always we're thinking, okay, what's going to work for me right now in my moment of protest or my moment of despair? And what's going to work long term as well, because some of our short term coping strategies don't help us to take away the bigger picture learning, like, wow, I'm stronger than I thought I was, or wow, if I really ask for help when I need it, people step up for me, you know?
I like how I think this is connected. How you use the term or the image of restoring an old house, and that grieving is you're in two different places at once. You're grieving the past and what you've lost, but you're also having then to build a new future maybe as a single or as a me and not a we. And that concept of restoring an old house. It's still the same old house, but it's changed somehow.
Yes.
And there's a dual action happening there for a grieving person.
There is. And also, no one gets to tell you what the house should look like now.
Right.
You know, it's your life to build now. Even though that may also have to encompass, you know, my sister also lost her mother, right? So there is a piece that we have to figure this out together. But it is things like, you know, after I was divorced, for example, and, you know, eventually I went on a few dates and I realized if I use the word we all the time, we went to graduate school, we moved to Ventura, California, we, you know, went on vacation. I'm having a conversation with someone who I potentially might like to become a we with one day. And to describe myself always as we doesn't make sense in the context that I'm in.
Right.
It makes perfect sense to say we when I'm talking to my sister, but now in this context, I need to think about, well, I also moved to Ventura. I also went on vacation. And so trying to figure out, who am I now? How is being widowed different from being single? Or am I a parent? What am I going to say if my child has died and people ask me when I have if I have children, right? So these ways of restoring our life are going to look different for each of us, and that's okay. There are no hard and fast rules, because we're restoring the house, we're restoring the life in the way that makes sense for us.
I've always appreciated that idea that we are really finding a new me in this too. Death brings a whole identity, and one of the interesting things that I've observed in a lot of people that I've seen is that, and often it is the woman who says things like, well, I think I'm going to get a chance to do this now. When when I was married, I just had kids and life got busy, and I never was able to pursue what I always wanted to pursue. And this death now has allowed this person to say, who am I now? Who do I want to be? And there's some pieces of me that I never really got to develop.
Yes.
And then that kind of brings up this, should I feel guilty about this, that I get to do this now? But that's true, where we now, that restoration of an old house is also the opportunity to explore what we might have not had a chance to explore, but wanted to.
Yes. And I think this is so important. I want to convey to people, when we're in a relationship with a living loved one, right? When the person is alive, we actually have this internal representation of them. If I say to you right now, imagine being hugged by, your partner or your child, you can do that. You don't actually need them present. And you can feel how lovely it is to be hugged right now. You can do that in their absence. That doesn't go away when the person dies, right? Our internal relationship with that person goes on, even in the absence of their external physical body. So we call these continuing bonds. But people decide how to negotiate that relationship, that inner relationship, in lots of different ways. So for one person, I interviewed a whole bunch of older adults for a specific study I was doing at UCLA. And, for some of them, they maintained these really active daily conversations, with their spouse who had died. They told them everything they were doing, and they complained about things, and they asked for advice and so forth. And for other people, it was, this is a chapter. I know that it was a good chapter. I'm so grateful for this time. And now I am living a different life. It was good then, and it's good now. And so we get to negotiate those internal conversations, those internal relationships in lots of different ways. But what's important is to know that they are internal. Right. And so we do need living loved ones as well. We do need someone who can hug us in the physical plane as well. Right. And so I think thinking about how we move forward can get very tied up in guilt. And guilt is often this much too narrow focus, right? Why not widen it to the full length of their life instead of focusing on those last few weeks? Or why not widen it to all the people in their life and not just the role that we played in their life, right? And that sometimes can help us to alleviate some of the guilt so that we can have a good life now that includes all of the importance of them, but recognizes that importance stems from the past.
Mary Frances, what do we know about what's happening for folks who are not able to do that, who who get stuck in that place of maybe protest, or the place of are not able to say, yes, I still carry them with me and I have this going forward. What do we know about that?
Well, one of the things we really have come to understand through very, evidence-based interventions, psychotherapy interventions, is there are a few ways that people get stuck. And part of psychotherapy, so cognitive behavior therapy for grief specifically, or prolonged grief treatment, which comes out of Columbia University and Kathy Shear. You can just Google prolonged grief and Columbia University, and you have wonderful resources there. And so we know that a couple of things happen. One is that people can develop more skills about allowing a wave of grief to overcome them, not being so terrified of it, but also developing that coping toolkit so that the wave can also recede again and we can move to whatever is next in the present moment. So some skills around what we might call emotion regulation, right? Coping with these waves of grief. Another thing that happens for people is there's often something about the death event that people aren't able to verbalize. So when I would interview people, I would ask them how their loved one died. And for many people, they said it was the first time that they had ever talked out loud about what happened to the person, to their body, perhaps, when they died, as a form of illness or as an accident. And being able to recall that memory, being able to use it in a narrative story way, gives us greater control over how we conceptualize it. It helps human beings to put the story into words. And so another thing that we sometimes do in psychotherapy is help them to tell the story again and again, not in a robotic kind of way, but allowing those feelings with anything that emerges to be something that we can manage, to think about, or to talk about. And then the last thing I would say is when we lose a loved one, we forget that we often lose our motivation, right? So if you had a child and caring for them, cooking for them, taking them to baseball practice, and if that was a primary source of meaning in your life, then figuring out what you even do with your time can be very difficult. Or if you had planned to retire with your spouse and your spouse dies, you may have no motivation to explore what to do with your time when you're retired. And so another piece of therapy can be finding ways to engage in new activities, even though they bring with them feelings of pain and grief. People think I have to wait for the motivation and the energy in order to do the thing. But actually what we find is you have to do the thing in order for the motivation and energy to emerge. And so in the context of a psychotherapy relationship, we can often support people in engaging those activities.
You reminded me there of the saying, let the feeling follow. Do the thing.
Yes.
Get out there and do it.
Yeah.
And then let the good feeling follow. The opposite maybe of not telling the story and giving that opportunity was, I remember you discussing the rumination, maybe repeating the story over and over and over as a way of avoiding.
Yeah. And this is exactly why I said in a robotic fashion.
Yes.
And the reason that I say that is grieving is a form of learning. And if we are telling, the story on repeat, so to speak, there's no new learning each time. You don't remember the other thing that happened. Or at the end of the book, I talk about the death of my mother from the perspective of being nearly 50 years old, of looking like her now, seeing her every day in the mirror. I tell the story very differently now than at 26, you know, when I didn't understand what it meant to be an adult woman, you know, and I miss her now in a very different way than I felt about that at 26. And this is a part of it as well, that if grieving is a form of learning, that internal relationship continues to grow and change, and the grief changes over time. And that's okay. It doesn't mean there's something wrong with me. I didn't not do something at 26. That means that now in my 50s, I suddenly miss her in a way that I couldn't have imagined back then. I didn't do something wrong in my grieving process. It's just that she will be an important loss in my life forever, along with a lot of other things in my life. But it's okay to have waves of grief 25 years later, you know?
So the narrative, your self-narrative about that, it evolves and it grows.
Yes.
And so when you say it's not robotically repeated, that's that stuck. And that sounds like protest to me, often that rumination. For you, it's like, oh, yes, I actually kind of interact with my experience of the law of losing my mother differently over time because I am learning how that's changed me, impacted me, how I move through the world, etc. Am I getting what you're saying? Yeah.
Yes, that's exactly it.
Yeah.
And, you know, I mean, I think also just to be clear, there's an infinite number of ways to grieve because we each are different. Our relationships with whoever died are different. And at the same time, we can see patterns. We can see things like, oh, some people get stuck in this one story, right? So if what you're hearing today, dear listener, makes sense to you, then run with that. I describe it as like lending you my glasses. I can show you on average what happens in my research studies. And if through my glasses you see something new for the first time, try it out. But they're not going to be your glasses. Not everything that I say is going to bring things into focus for you.
So grief is universal, but our experience of our loss is unique.
Yes, that's exactly it. I think of it as like saying, you know, people will say, I want to grieve the right way, or I want to do this right or well. And I say, well, that's like saying, I want to do marriage the right way. You know, like everybody's marriage looks different because you're dealing with two different people and two different people and a different chemistry in every scenario. So yes, there are things you can do that probably make marriage go poorly. You know, and so there are patterns we can see. And at the same time, it's going to be an individual thing.
At a certain point, you talk about people who, after about a year, if they don't show any sort of forward movement, if we can call it that, in their grief resolution, that it's likely that change in the future is improbable. And what are the implications of that for folks who are trying to support someone who is that stuck?
Yeah. So we use this term prolonged grief. And what we mean by that isn't just that people continue to have grief. That's just human life. When you've lost someone, you're going to have grief. But it's exactly as you said, it's that the trajectory isn't changing. So early on in grieving, waves of grief are very intense for many people and very frequent, and they're kind of all-consuming, and physiologically we have to sort of navigate regulation and so forth. But over time, much like the stock market, we see ups and downs and ups and downs and ups and downs. And even though you can have terrible days on the stock market, you might still see at the end of the year that the stock market overall is up. And that's what we typically see with grieving. But there's a group of people where they have ups and downs, but there's no real change in terms of their overall experience. It's still just as intense and frequent as it was at the beginning. And this is the group that we worry about because, as you say, if there hasn't been much change in the first year, we anticipate that there may not be much change going forward. Whereas if there's been change in the first year, even if people are having a difficult time, we'll probably continue to see change. And so we do really think about the idea that people who are not showing an integration where grief is becoming a part of their life, that intervention is warranted for them, mostly because we know from these randomized clinical trials that we can get them back on this typical trajectory by giving them increased skills and new ways of looking at things and encouraging new habits and behaviors. And so the goal is never to get rid of grief. That's not a thing. But the goal is to teach them how to integrate, so not so much resolution, but integration of the grief into their ongoing life.
Right. So the key is if they're out there unsupported and unchanged, but if we get to that point, then there is hope if they reach out for that type of support. Great.
Yes, that's it.
Great.
And so, this is also within the context of if that's what they want.
Right.
Right.
Yes.
Because your grieving may look very different from my grieving. And I may be able to fully judge you from the seat I'm in and say, well, that doesn't look right. But perhaps this is, in fact, how this person incorporates grief into their life. Perhaps they do spend a lot of time working with other people who are grieving, or perhaps they are devoting a lot of energy to a memorial or whatever it is. And we get to choose that. That is our freedom to choose that way of being. But if what they're saying is, I don't know how to move forward, I feel stuck, then we know there is actually help available.
Right.
So maybe as we start to move towards the end of our discussion, could we talk about some of the kind of restorative, use the word comfort, self-soothing resources that we need to build? So one of the things I was just so aware of through reading your book is around that idea of co-regulation. I love the idea of, you say, people are like our external pacemaker, right? And so when we lose one of our key figures in our life that helps us regulate ourselves, then part of the learning we need to do in grief is to regulate ourselves.
Yeah.
And I mean, part of that might be pulling in new people or people in closer to help fill some of that void. But then some of it also is our own building that capacity within ourselves. Yes?
Yeah, I'll give you sort of a simple example of learning to eat dinner again. Now, if you and your spouse have navigated what to eat, when to eat, how much to eat for decades together, and you are separate from them, it can be very difficult to figure out to even have an appetite. Right. And so you may feel it is very common for people not to have much appetite after the loss of someone. But over time, we have to figure out, okay, so what does taste good? What does make sense to me? And, wonderful, wonderful study by Dr. Vesnaver looking at how widows navigated this and talked about these sort of two phases where initially people had low appetite. They didn't really know how to cook for themselves. And again, not because they technically couldn't cook even, but if, for example, when I got divorced, my choices had always included the other person. And once I was on my own, I literally didn't even know what I wanted to eat. It took some time to reconnect with, I guess that does sound good. I guess I'll try that. I didn't used to like that, but actually that sounds really good tonight. And then also, as you said, bringing in other people. So my father, who then was widowed for a long time because my mother died at 63, he would invite all the widowers from my little rural hometown over on Sunday and make dinner. And, they were not fancy meals. This was crock pot chicken and so forth. But of course, these other men learned, I have to make a grocery list and go shopping, or I have to invite someone over and I have to develop a whole system around this so that I have an appetite once I sit down with friends, with good food and so forth.
Wow. There's so much wonderful stuff in both of your books. I just want to say thank you so much for And both of those books, I think for me, just personally speaking, it is so significant to recognize that grief, the physiological pieces of grief that we see, but the neurological pieces, what's going on in the brain, and then what's going on in the body, and not seeing those as something that we have to run out and get a pill to fix, but that we need to be aware of that and be patient and kind to ourselves, compassionate to ourselves, and for other people around us who I think, as we've talked about many times, they need us to be better for their sake, not for our own. And so, having the courage to do this on our own terms, in our own timing, and supporting people who need to do that in that way. But thank you so much for helping me understand grief in a different way. We've all talked about how much we have learned from grievers themselves. That's where we learn so much about grief. But these books, and you particularly in these podcasts, have helped all of us, but helped me personally. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, David. Yes.
Lovely summary, David. I was left with the covers of the books, and I love the fact that you made me feel like a system.
Yes.
And that from the very small, and the covers have that molecular quality to them, from the microscopic things we can't see. And then I got all Star Child and Dawning of the Age of Aquarius, that the system goes through me, and then I'm a part of that system, and it just shoots out into the universe. And I'm not an individual.
Yeah.
Right. I love when anyone can tell me that I'm not an individual, that I'm part of a collective, and that we're not alone.
Yeah.
And a strange thing to have come from these two books, but I thought together they just create this wonderful sense for me of a system, and that when one part is affected, the whole system is affected. And this book brought me down to the things I can't see, that I don't know what's going on inside me. My thoughts might ramble and rage, and my feelings I can have, but how the hell do I know what's going on with my heart and my cortisol levels all the time, So I loved that tiny molecular to the whole full expanse of the universe, and somewhere we all fit in. And then I thought, wow, the covers say that very same thing. And I don't know if that was intentional or not, but as a pair, they're wonderful, wonderful read. And I can say, use the information all the time. I'm constantly telling people to pick up one of those books.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
I just want to give a shout out. Your Grieving Body is one of the first books I have ever listened to on audiobook. And you're narrating it, right?
I am. Yeah. I do. I read the book. It was such an interesting and wonderful experience.
Yeah. So that's another way for people to take it in. Yeah. And so as we just wrap up, is there any piece that you want to end with, or just feels like we need to say to kind of just complete this conversation?
I think I'll leave you with one more metaphor. How's that?
Love that.
So in some Native American nations, like the Cherokee Nation, they will sometimes cut their braid off when a loved one dies, which I just think is such a wonderfully expressive, right? The people around you immediately know. But the thing that I love is, think how long it takes your hair to grow. And that's a totally natural physiological process. And no one says, why isn't your hair growing faster, right? It is what it is.
Love it.
Thank you, Mary Frances.
Thank you.
Take care. Thank you for listening to What Now? On the Threshold of Life, Death, and Grief. What Now is produced in partnership with Hospice Peterborough, dedicated to providing compassionate care and support to individuals and families facing life-limiting illness and loss. What Now is recorded at Thin Spaces Studio in Peterborough, Ontario. Special thanks to Paradise Garage for providing the music. Technical support is provided by Sean Heichert and audio engineering by Kevin Fleming. More episodes of What Now are available for free on most major podcast platforms. If you found value in our conversations, please support us by following the show, leaving a 5-star review, and sharing it with your friends and loved ones. If you'd like to support the essential work of Hospice Peterborough, please consider visiting hospicepeterborough.org/donate. Your contribution helps us continue to provide vital care and support. Until next time, may you find peace and comfort on your journey.